So we're going to take a look here at probably one of the most common and easily recognisable weeds in the UK. It's called Stiggy Nettles. We've all been stung at some point by this plant, and because of that we've all quickly learned how to identify this one. So let's take a look at the stem and the young shoots. So if you look up the stem, you can see there's needles that grow all the way up the stem and all the way up the veins on the underside of the leaf. So at the base of each one of those needles there's a sac that's filled with chemicals, and as soon as those needles puncture into your skin, it squirts those chemicals under it and you get that rash reaction. It's said that if you pick it up quite firmly, you can pop those sacs before the needles ever go into your skin. Personally, I always get stung a little bit. It always happens. Actually, I find with nettles that I commonly get stung by them when I'm reaching past them to try and pick something a bit further and it just rubs up my arm. That's when I'll get a rash, whereas I'm actually concentrating on picking just the stems of it. It doesn't sting me as much, but it will. So it's always advised to pop a pair of marigolds on when you go out picking this one. From an ID point of view, we've got a lobed leaf, slightly heart-shaped with lightly serrated edge. The only things this can really be confused with is the dead nettles, which are also edible, so you don't need to worry too much. You can actually use both interchangeably and quite similarly. As a food, this should be classed as a superfood. It's unbelievably high in minerals and vitamins and really should be up there with superfoods. In fact, I think if you pop this onto supermarket shelves, it would get that superfood stamp. So, this is it very young. Later in the year, it'll start to pull up a slightly taller shoot, and the leaves will grow oppositely, continue to grow up that shoot. The leaves can still be eaten. Once it gets past about knee height, the stem's starting to get a bit fibrous, so we want to avoid eating the stem then, but you'll be able to tell because if you bend it, it'll be really stringy, and we don't want to be eating that part. And then it'll get to full height, it'll produce a whole shoot of flowers that come down. They're kind of very tiny and green, and then those flowers almost instantly turn into seeds, so you can't really tell the difference between them too much. But they can be eaten. Every part of this can be eaten. So when they're young like this, if we look at it from a food perspective, we can use this in loads of stuff. So I'm just picking off the top 8 leaves, and I could just wilt that straight off. So I'd pop it in a pan with a little bit of butter, let it soften, a little bit of lemon juice, and I can use that as a side dish, just all in itself, nothing else. Probably a little bit of salt and pepper. I can add it into dishes, so I can chop it up and pop it through dishes just like I would a spinach, or spring greens, or chard, or anything like that. Flavour-wise, it's spinach-ish is the flavour. Or I could make crisps out of it. So for the crisps, we pick off the very top parts like this, and you can do it in 2 ways. We could either chuck that into a pan of oil and make it crispy, so we'd fry it for about 30 seconds and it'd go entirely crispy, and it's got like a slightly seaweedy, crispy seaweedy-ish flavour, which is really nice. Or we could spray it with a little bit of light oil, pop it in the oven and let it dry out and crisp up like that, which is a bit like kale crisps is the kind of flavour you get. Quite often I'll do that once every 2 weeks and then keep it in a jar, and then when I want a crunchy texture on stuff, let's say I'm doing a crunchy topping on something, I'll crunch this up and chuck it in, a bit like you'd crunch crisps up and chuck it on top of food. It gives a slightly different texture, which is really nice. Obviously you can use it for making soup, which is probably the most common one that people think of nettles. So we pick the leaves or the stems or the tops. We'd avoid any old stems, and the base of the soup I usually do is a leek and potato. So I'll get either, if I'm going wild, I'll use wild garlic or 3-cornered leek. If I'm not, I'll just use a standard leek. Cook that with some potatoes, add these in just before I'm going to blend it, and then blend it. And that's my nettle and leek and potato soup, which is really, really tasty. On that note, you can also eat it uncooked and raw, which is where you're going to get most of the benefit from the vitamins and minerals because they're not cooked out. So we can blend this and it pops all those sacs of chemicals before we ever drink it or eat it. And I make things like smoothies out of it, which is really nice. So I'll do, instead of a pear and spinach smoothie, I'll do a pear and nettle smoothie. So chuck this into the blender, just raw like this, and blitz it up and it won't sting me after. If you're thinking of it, the easiest way is to think of this as a spinach substitute. So any recipe that calls for spinach, as long as it's not raw, it's either blended, pureed or cooked, because we don't want to eat this raw because it'll sting us. And then you can just substitute any recipe that has spinach in it. So that, in theory, opens up thousands of recipes for us to use. When it gets a little bit taller, like we say, it's going to have, I mean, these are the old shoots from it, it's going to have thick, stringy, woody shoots, and we don't want to be eating those bits, but we can utilise them. So if we cut them down to the ground, we can take the tops off and we use that fresh, and then the rest of the leaves and the stem, which is a bit more fibrous, we can use for making things like stalks. So we can put it into boiling water, let it boil, and then take the stems out, and then we've got a nettle, well, just like an umami, earthy, rich, spinachy stock, which you can then use for loads of other things. One thing I like to do out of that is make something called Nettle Cordial, which is really tasty. So I take those stems, boil them down. Amounts vary. I'd usually just try and put as much in. I'd try and make it as strong as possible, and I can always dilute it later. So I'd boil those down, probably boil them for about 15 minutes, take out the nettles, and then I ended up with like a really dark green liquid. And then I'd add equal amounts of liquid of sugar. So 50-50 sugar to liquid. It sounds like a lot, but this is a cordial, pure cordial we're making. And then I just squeeze oranges in, squeeze lemons in, and then zest of lemon as well. And I'd just do that to taste, so I'd keep taking a teaspoon out, add a little bit of water to it and taste it like I would a cordial. And then does it need more lemon? Yes or no? I'll squeeze a bit more in, and I work from it that way. And then the seed pods, so the seeds and flowers, once they come on, they can be pulled off and dried and consumed like that. Very, very high in protein. If we look at nettles from a non-food point of view, so from more of a bushcraft point of view, when it produces these long stems, we can use those for making fibre as well. So we'd grab the stems off, we'd bash them to break up the woody pith, so this stuff inside, we'd break that apart, and then the fibres on the outside, the green parts, they would come away from that pith, and we'd hang that over a branch to dry, and then about 90% of the moisture would go out of it, so it'd go to almost nothing, and then we'd put that in a tiny bit of liquid, and then we'd soften it up, and then we can use that as cordage. We can spin it together with other fibres we've got from nettle, and we can tie things with it, or bind things with it. It's very similar to something like linen is a similarish fabric that we've currently got. That's the thread similar to nettles. If we look at it from more of an art perspective, the roots can be used to make a yellow to orange dye. So if you dig up the roots of nettles, which are extreme, they will pass out through here, there'll be absolutely loads of them. We'd boil that and we'd get a really strong yellow to orange dye from them also. So that's stinging nettles. It's a prolific weed, absolutely everywhere. We can all find it quite easily and we can all identify it, and it's a very easy to eat wild ingredient.